Hello, ladies and gents. It's Justin Johnson. It's Monday, 27th of December. I hope you all had a great Christmas. Back to module DD 103. Yes, Justin Johnson. Back to the module DD 103. Just after Christmas, hope you had a great Christmas celebration. I'm trying to get on my reading. I'm trying to do an audio book on investigating the social world 2, edited by Deborah H. Drake, Andy Morris, Alan Shipman, and Katie Wheeler. We're on chapter 3, page 84. We're on chapter 3, Governing Common Resources by Daniel Conway and Edward Bosnich. Page 84. Common resources state sovereignty. The notion of common resources in the contemporary world poses challenges for the idea that states are sovereign, and that the international community can also act like a sovereign nation state. So where did the notion of sovereignty originate, and how has it changed in light of the need to form global governance regimes? In everyday language, the word sovereign means an individual or body that has supremacy, rank, or authority over others. In political terms, sovereignty originally developed in Europe to justify the attempt by monarchs to consolidate control over their kingdoms where authority had originally been shared by a feudal aristocracy and the Catholic Church. The concept of sovereignty contributed to the formation of European states, particularly after the signing of the Peace of the Westphalia in 1648. Following the 30 Years' War, Westphalia negotiations established the principle of autarky and a sovereign state in Europe that would not interfere with one another's domestic affairs. What became known as the Westphalian system developed into the dominant international governance system over the following centuries, promoting the principles of statehood and government at state level. As European empires declined across the 20th century, the establishment of the UN in 1945 was recognised in the independent sovereign nation states and provided an international framework by which states could formulate, monitor and implement international rules. As part of this, UN enabled the negotiations of the right of sovereignty, access and exploitation of the sea between the states. National sovereignty, therefore, may be thought as a special case of property rights. By entering international agreements on trade, access to resources, regulating pollution, and so forth, nations accept constraints on their absolute freedom of action. Signatory states agree in 1967, Outer Space Treaty, for example, to forego the traditional right of territorial acquisition by discovery. By discovering occupation exchange for peaceful access to the domain of outer space. Some international agreements impose restrictions on the activities that have traditionally been the rights of national governments, such as the right to use any weapons in wartime, the international ban on the use of landmines. For example, some impose restrictions on the activities of people and corporations that are under international jurisdiction, such as the ban on the manufacture and the use of fluorocarbons, page 85. The emergence of international resource domains and of pollution reveals how the traditional concept of state sovereignty may no longer apply in tackling contemporary global challenges, global pollution of air and water. It relates to a foiled processes and problems and can only be addressed if there is international cooperation and agreement. The depletion of fish stocks and the use of the ozone destroying chemicals in industrialised states have serious consequences for public health and economic prosperity worldwide. Nation states have chosen to cooperate in the formation of new international governance regimes, which modify states' sovereign control over the affected resources and economic processes. In Activity 2, do you think the international community has a duty to collectively regulate and restrict damaging environmental activities, as well as the right of access to global common resources, even if it undermines the concept of state sovereignty? Or do you think that, as states such as China and India have sometimes argued, states do not have the right to develop their economies and have access to resources in their region as they see fit? There is no right or wrong answer to this debate, as you have read. There has been a strong argument that international regulation is essential to protect the environmental integrity of common resources, such as the high seas, and global common resources have increasingly come under regulation during the 20th and the 21st centuries, such as in the case of the atmosphere. These governance regimes inevitably produce nation-state sovereignty over certain areas. However, one could argue that the Western and Northern states, such as those in Europe and North America, have had centuries to exploit common resources and create regulations to their own benefit. In this line of argument, newly developing states, such as India and China, should also have the right to access resources in their region for their economic benefit. Page 86. Sovereignty means to have the ultimate authority and control. Europe nation-state system, established at the Treaty of Westphalia, is premised on sovereign nation-states. International regulation of global common resources challenges, or at least adapts, the traditional notion of state sovereignty, requiring states to defer to international regulations about common resources and change certain behaviours such as those relating to environmental damage. Page 87. Mate, I'm just on my studying my book, mate, for audio books on Spotify and Apple Cars, buddy. Sorry I can't talk, mate. I'll catch you shortly. Page 87. Chapter 4, Case Study 1, Hydropolitics in Central Asia. Hydropolitics is all about the ocean, state laws, and fishery rights. Hydropolitics in Central Asia. So far, you have seen broad terms common resource refers to those resources that lie beyond the political reach of any one state, and how regulating these common resources poses challenges to the notion of state sovereignty. But now we will consider a specific example where resources are shared between the territories of a particular nation state across particular nation borders. The following section explores the contested politics over such resources through the example of water and a trans-boundary resource in Central Asia. Politics of water following the end of the Cold War. Concerns about security threats beyond the traditional superpower rivalry of the United States and the Soviet Union began to gain currency. As noted earlier, one of the key areas that stated to concern academics and governments alike was the need for collective action to prevent incidences of the tragedy of the commons. This was not only important in terms of avoiding environmental catastrophe, but also had a potential powerful impact on relations between states. Water can often be considered as a regional or global common resource, as it is a shared resource that crosses national boundaries and whose use is contested. Water is particularly important because access to it is considered a basic human right. Consequently, water is a resource that has the potential for both cooperation and conflict. Perhaps the two key features of the international domain in which states interact. The interaction between states over water can range from disputes over contested maritime boundaries and access to transboundary water resources such as rivers flowing from one state to another, to cooperation between states on managing water courses and preventing environmental problems. The terms hydropolitics is used in politics and international studies to describe this dynamic. As you will see in the following case study, Changes in domestic and international politics can also have a major effect on the politics of water. For example, when new states come into being and are faced and competing claims and the desire to assert themselves as sovereign entities. Page 88. The management of water resources has become a concern for governments across the world, particularly in areas such as scarcity of water becoming an issue. In the early 1990s, scholars argued that water was likely to become a source of conflict in the coming years. Geelick 1993, Heimer-Dixon 1994, others, however, rejected the notion of water wars as something of a myth. For example, Wolf 1998, he observed that, with the exception of a few minor skirmishes, a war has never been fought over water as yet. Potential for conflict does, however, become more acute when water resources cross boundaries. This is particularly true for rivers that are sources of energy. Irrigation and drinking water for state or states. These competing use create a dynamic and of dependence between the upstream and downstream states in terms of control over the resource. If the upstream state controls the headwaters of a particular river that a neighbouring downstream state requires, then it potentially holds a considerable amount of power over them. Situations such as this are often referred to as zero-sum games. One party's gain is balanced by another party's losses. If you subtract total losses from total gains, they sum to zero. Allen 2014, page 158. Put simply, one state's gain is achieved through the other state losing out, and the potential for conflict is clear. However, this view is contested by some who highlight the historical cooperation between states on such issues. Dowdy 2008, Wolf 1998. As noted earlier, there have been no major conflict over water thus far, and international organisations have been set up to promote cooperation over water resources through the United Nations Convention on the Protection and Use of Transboundary water courses and international lakes. In the case of Central Asia, water politics have become an increasingly pressing issue since the states of the region gained independence following the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991. You'll see how the spectre of conflict and potential for cooperation enlarge over the international relations of the region in relation to water, and you'll also explore how this relates to the notion of sovereignty that you were introduced to earlier. Hydropolitics in Central Asia. The Soviet Union was formed and dissolved on the 31st of December 1991. This was one of the major events in international history, ending the Cold War and damaging the nature of politics. But it was also the beginning of a new era for the people living in constituent republics as they become newly independent states. It's page 89. With the independence came grappled with the realities of becoming sovereign entities no longer controlled by Moscow. The newly independent states inherited the remnants of the centrally planned economy that had been served the inserts of the Soviet Union. As a result, the whole swaths of the new state infrastructures were integrated with one another, from the oil and the natural gas pipelines running from the Caspian Sea to the Russian heartland to the management of the water resources and irrigation systems. These now cross international borders rather than lying within the one unified state. The difficulties that the republics encountered in establishing themselves as independent sovereign states were further complicated by similar ethnic tensions, which had in turn been exacerbated by the arbitrary drawing of the individual republics' borders during the early years of the Soviet Union. Those problems were illustrated in Central Asia, which became home to 5 independent states: Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan. Figure 4.6 shows the political borders of newly independent states that were inherited from the Soviet Union. It also highlights the main ethnic groups found in the region, so you can see the complexities at play here. While the Soviet Union drawing of borders in Central Asia was broadly carried out along patterns of ethnic settlement and linguistics, it failed to take into account the region's complex ethnic geography. As an example, the primarily Tajik majority cities of Burqa and Samarkand were incorporated into Uzbek Soviet Socialist Republic, and the predominantly Uzbek city of the Osh became part of the Kyrgyz SSR. This exercise also imposed the idea of nationality among the peoples of the region, which had previously not been the main self-identifying factor in Central Asia. It arguably represents a classic case of divide and rule, whereby a ruling power divides a territory up in order to manage it and prevent it from uniting to changing its rule. These boundary lines become international borders of sovereign states after 1991. You may wonder what all this has to do with water. Central Asia was at the heart of the Soviet cotton grounding industry, a water-intensive industry that remains vitally important to the region today, particularly in Uzbekistan. During the Soviet era, a huge irrigation network was built to serve the cotton industry. The diversion of water from the region's two main rivers, the Amur Dari and the Syria Dari, throughout the 1960s and 1970s, led to one of the most significant environmental tragedies in recent times. The desiccation of the Aral Sea, which lies on the border of Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, one of the world's fourth largest lakes by 1991. The Aral Sea had shrunk to half its surface area. Rainfall 2002, and the shrinking continues with the most recent measurements estimating the sea to be around 10% of its original size. The desiccation has caused major health problems in the area, with the now exposed seabed covered in salt and toxic chemicals that are carried into the surrounding population. Review. Page 81. While the water usage related to the cotton monoculture in the region remained a domestic issue until 1991, the subsequent emergence of independent states in the region meant that new countries sought to establish sovereignty over its resources. This meant that water became an international issue, as the headwaters of the region's two main rivers were now located in separate states, ones that relied heavily on them for agricultural needs. 90% of the region's water resources are located in Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan and Uzbekistan. Use over half, 52% of the region's entire water. As a result of its cotton industry further complicating the picture, another major legacy of the Soviet era in Central Asia was the creation of an electricity water nexus, whereby the generation of electricity from hydropower in upstream countries was linked to the water needs to those downstream. Under the Soviet regime, huge reservoirs were constructed in upstream Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan to aid cotton production downstreams, primarily in Uzbekistan. Water flows made essentially from Moscow hydropower stations were also built and incorporated into the region's energy grids, so that the power generated could be distributed across the region. Coal and gas were supplied by Uzbekistan to the upstream republics that lacked fossil fuel resources. Again, all centrally managed by Moscow. However, on independence, this created a major issue as the states were locked into independence that clashed with their desire to protect their sovereign resources and as independent states. Consequently, the upstream states, Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, viewed their water and control over it as a commodity. Untitled Chapter 2. Page 82. Untitled Chapter 3. Govern common resources by Danuel Kazakh. but they are subject to fuel deliveries and reliant on energy from Uzbekistan's own into the sovereign energy infrastructure with which they were left. These resources have become bargaining chips for the prospective countries and now play a key role in relations between them. Since independence, there have been regular diplomatic clashes among the states. Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan were among the poorest of the Soviet republics, but they now control the water required by Uzbekistan for its cotton and agriculture industry. They also want to develop their considerable hydropower potential as a lack of fossil fuels for power generation. If they hold back water, it has a detrimental effect on the downstream Uzbekistan if they release a large volume through their dams to generate power. But this can also cause severe flooding downstream. Both scenarios have a damaging impact on Uzbekistan's cotton industry. In relation, Uzbekistan has periodically seized its gas supplies to Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan and closed its borders. The closing of borders is especially problematic as the transport infrastructure inherited from the Soviet era cut across what are now international boundaries. Uzbekistan is also the most populous state in the region, is a military power, and has threatened force against the neighbours if water is used as a weapon against it. The potential for further exacerbation of such tensions can be seen when the focus of the era where the borders of Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan and Uzbekistan meet. The Fergana Valley, this has long been one of the most populous areas of Central Asia and has traditionally served as its agriculture heartland. The drawing of borders between the then Soviet republics during the 1920s left the valley crisscrossed by a complex web of borders, including several enclaves, whereby one's territory is completely surrounded by another. During Soviet times, these borders were merely administrative with little in the way of actual demarcation, where the borders are physically defined. They had little impact on daily life. Following independence, they become international borders, but remain poorly demarcated, particularly in mountains surrounded by the Fergana Valley. Complex political geography and difficult topography is illustrated in figure 3.7. The national borders marked in red. Note the presence of large Toggle and Karakum reservoirs and the Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan respectively, and the lower altitude of the valley in the centre of the map, largely located inside Uzbek territory and a home to the region's cotton industry. There you go. I think this is like near Moscow. There you go. Page 93. Water disputes can also take on an ethnic dimension. In the region, with minority groups such as large Uzbek population in the Kyrgyz city of Osh, often living in border areas, disputes among local communities over water. It can quickly escalate because of mobilisation among community networks noted in ethnic solidarity, because each state contains significant minorities that have close ties to communities in neighbouring states, such communities are often treated with suspicion. There have been campaigns for greater cultural and linguistic rights among the large Tajik minority living in Uzbekistan and a significant Uzbek population living in the Osh region of Kyrgyzstan has also periodically risen up against preserved discrimination. The Fergana Valley has traditionally been a religiously conservative area and has, at times, chafed against the secular governments of the region. The valley has also often been targeted because of Uzbekistan's government, serving it as being home to the Al-Qaeda affiliated Islamic movement of Uzbekistan. Page 94. Who have fought alongside the Taliban in Afghanistan and carried out sporadic attacks across the region. This has particularly incurred the wrath of Islam Karimov, president of Uzbekistan since independence in 1991. Under the pretext of the US-led war on terror, Karimov campaigned to rid the region of Islamic extremism, thus further inflaming tensions. As a result, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan and Uzbekistan have, in addition to their clashes over water, accused each other over harbouring terrorists or of not doing enough to tackle the problem. The wider regional picture must also be considered. The region is susceptible to instability spilling over from Afghanistan. As the actions of the IMU demonstrate, Central Asia has also seen an influx of Chinese and Western investments in the considerable oil and natural gas resources in the Caspian Basin, which forms the southwest border of Kazakhstan, as well as a more assertive Russian presence in a region it considers as its own near abroad. Therefore, outside forces have a further influence on the region's international relations. Conflict of cooperation. It is clear that the situation in Central Asia is complex and has the potential for conflict. The water issue, along with other problems such as lack of government, over-reliance on cotton, and the spectre of terrorism has led to the region becoming highly securitized. This means that such issues are held up as vital to each other state's national security. How might such problems lead to conflict between the states of Central Asia? What are the potential triggers for conflict there? How do water issues exacerbate other existing tensions? There are a number of potential triggers for conflict in the region. If, for example, Tajikistan or Kyrgyzstan were to withhold water supplies to downstream Uzbekistan, then this would deprive the latter of a basic right in having access to water, and seriously damaging its economy. Uzbekistan could retaliate by withholding gas supplies to the two states, which could have a major impact on their populations during the severe winters experienced there. It could have a knock-on effect and exacerbate inter-ethnic relations within each state, owing to the region's complex borders and ethnic mix. Page 95. One state might feel obliged to step in and support its ethnic kin in a neighbouring state in their rights are not being fully respected. Although this paints a rather bleak picture, cross-border problems also bring the potential for cooperation. Let's look at water again, for example. Up until now, states of Central Asia are primarily concentrated on bilateral initiatives to reconcile issues in their relations. While such moves can tackle issues in a short term, they are not sustainable because the tension between the states cannot be considered in isolation. Marcello, 2008, and in fact involve a great number of wider complicated factors as outlined earlier. Upon independence, all 5 of the Central Asian states signed the Almaty Agreement, which committed them to maintaining sovereign allocations of water. This reflected the principles of international agreements such as the Helsinki Rules of 1996 and the UN Convention on the Protection and Use of Transboundary Watercourses in international lakes. This was followed up by the further multilateral initiatives among the Central Asian states such as the Interstate Coordinated Water Commission, the Interstate Council on Problems of the Aral Sea Basin, and the International Fund for the Aral Sea. However, these have essentially reinforced sovereign area management and central planning over water in the region. And the problems have continued as states have sought to pursue their own national interests. Thus, while attempts have been made to find common solutions, the spectre of conflict remains when considering the role of water in affecting relations between the state of Central Asia. As states that are still relatively who, in their exercise of sovereignty, they are keen to preserve their national interests, which are often at odds with those of their neighbours. In this case study, we've seen how commons transboundary resources are a pressing issue due to water being a basic human right. In the next section, we'll see how competition between states and contestations over sovereignty have led to increasing diplomatic tensions between states in East Asia. Page 96, Chapter 3, Common Resources. Governing common resources. The picture of hydropolitics in Central Asia is a complex relation between states, complicated by artificial borders drawn when the region was part of the Soviet Union. Industrial and power infrastructure are in place during Soviet times, which means that certain areas are dependent on others for resources such as water and power. Regional environmental problems such as the desiccation of the Aral Sea. The fact that the republics of Central Asia are relatively sovereign independent states. Case study: South and East China Seas. At the start of the chapter, you read about the dispute between UK and Spain on sovereignty over Gibraltar and its surrounding waters. Section 4 revealed how changes in geopolitics, specifically collapse of the Soviet Union and the emergence of new states, caused tensions and conflict on resource domains across borders. As Figure 3.8 shows, disputes over cross and ownership of areas of the sea. The island within it grow considerably in the Eastern Asian area, with China involved in the most disputes. These disputes could potentially have far greater international consequences than disagreement over Gibraltar than they have escalated in recent decades. Because of the growing economic and political power of Asian countries and their technological ability to exploit resources in the seabed, the Asian region is increasingly powerful in the global economy, but these disputes over common resources have become a growing foreign policy concern. For the United States in particular, since the World War, the United States have been a guarantor of security of Japan, Taiwan, the Philippines and South Korea. The region accounted for 33% of the world economy in 2007, compared to 21% and 23% for the United States and Western Europe respectively. Denmark in 2010, an increase in political and economic power of some Asian countries, ensure they have significant influence when it comes to addressing global issues such as climate change. The South China Sea is bordered by four nation states: Borneo, China, the Philippines and Vietnam, while the East China Sea is bordered by China and Japan. While not of the explicit interest here, it is also the third body of water in the area. The Sea of Japan, which connects North and South Korea, Russia and Japan. Diplomatic relations in this area have long been strained, but particularly so in recent years, for example. The recognition of Japan's disagreement with China over the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands in 2012 symbolises Japan's concern about China's growing political and economic might. The islands are small and uninhabited, but they're approximately to shipping lanes. Their rich fishing grounds and nearby potential oil, gas and methane reserves make them a significant asset. Both Japan and China lay claim to the island, arguing that they have the right to control them. But the United States recognised that under Japan's sovereignty in recent years, China has been increasingly aggressive in sending vessels and aircrafts into the area. Chinese and Japanese fishing vessels also collided with one another as part of the dispute. The US government has been increasingly concerned with the dispute over sovereignty, using both sides to negotiate and abide by international law. Contestation of natural resources is particularly acute, as the region is home to only 3% of the world's proven oil resources reserves and 8% of its international gas reserves. This means that Asian countries have to import the majority of their energy supplies. China, for example, already imports more than half of its oil, and Japan almost all of its oil and gas. As Clark stated, according to US Department of Energy, in the next 25 years, Asia's energy consumption is expected to grow faster than anywhere else in the world. This makes the likelihood of tensions over sovereignty rights and to exploit resources in resource-rich areas like Senkaku or Daewoo Islands increasingly likely. As you read earlier in this chapter, UNCLOS allows states to claim a 200-mile extension of sovereignty from the coastline, and all the countries involved in the region have asserted this right. Indeed, China has gone further and requested an extension of sovereignty beyond 200 miles into an extensive area of the East China Sea. China has indicated that it considers it to be its right to exploit oil and gas resources in the area, and has sought to prevent other states from undertaking deep sea exploration of potential resources. The United States have been increasingly drawn into these disputes, and the regional body, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, has also tried to mediate into it, yet it remains to be seen how equitable and lawful the claims for sovereignty and exploitation of common mineral resources will actually be. China argues that the money it claims will predate the framing of UNCLOS in 1982, so it should not be restrained by UNCLOS, and has pointed out that US Congress has ratified UNCLOS. China claims that there is an element of hypocrisy to the United States' insistence in China's obeying UNCLOS, when the United States has not ratified it. This has led to a concern that China may start to ignore the treaty altogether, not abide the permanent court of arbitration decisions, as well as having political ramifications. Claiming sovereignty and exploiting the seabed's mineral resources could have major environmental consequences if not done responsibly. Disputes over sovereignty and common resources in South and East China seas are likely to continue. Page 100. The politics of South and East China seas are increasingly contentious. Changing geopolitics of the area, the economic and political rise of China, and the comparative decline of the United States means that countries such as China claim they have the right to access and exploit areas of common resources. There is increasing demand for finite resource and energy supplies. There is also concern of UNCLOS as an international governance regime will no longer be sufficient in regulating access, ownership, and exploitation of the seas in this region. Page 101. This chapter has explored how common resources in areas of the world that have been considered to be the common property and responsibility of humankind have come to be managed and arguably mismanaged. In the 20th and 21st centuries, the sea and inland waters are long-standing examples of global common resources, but they can also encompass other resources such as oil and gas. Following technological developments, these resources can now be exploited in a world hungry for additional food, minerals and energies to support growing populations. States are increasingly involved in disputes and conflicts over the right to control and exploit these resources. The concept of sovereignty is central to the development of the nation-state system. It has also started to shift and become contested. Common resources have become strategically important, making them the focus of power struggle between states. International multicultural organisations such as the United Nations play an increasingly important role in trying to define and police rights and responsibilities regarding common resources on a global scale. Yet, as power relations among states, geopolitics have changed the collapse of Soviet Union, creating new states and new borders, the economic and political state rise of China, and the comparative decline of the United Nations. Contestation over common resources has become increasingly acute. The outcome of these power struggles could have significant political and environmental consequences for the international community, as illustrated by the case studies of the Central Asian region and the East and and South China Seas. Chapter 4 on page. Chapter 4. Putting a price on common resources by chapter. Violent ship. Page underlined. Just doing my study, buddy. I've got another 20 minutes reading. I'll be with you shortly. Just have a quick break. Yeah, just have a quick break. I'll be with you in about. I'll probably do about another 10 minutes reading. My head. I'd like to get myself ahead. I'm gonna do another hour tonight as well. Right, tomorrow. Got another 10 minutes reading, girl. I'm not being rude. I've just got to get my study on my work. What is your live reading? What do you mean? Tarot reading, I don't know. I don't know how to do tarot reading. Reading my studies, politics. Introduction. Page 109, Module BD 103. Investigating social work 2. What ensures that their self-interested actions of individuals produce harmony rather than conflict? Is a long-standing question among social scientists and have some found a surprisingly straightforward answer. The price system. The Austrian economist Friedrich Hayek expressed the belief that prices set by free markets have created the opportunities and incentives that drove sustained wealth creation, especially in North America and Western Europe. By using prices as a guide or as signals were led to serve the demands and enlist the powers of capacities of people of whom we knew nothing. I'll be with you in a sec, girl. It was because we relied on a system which we had never understood and which we never designed that we had been able to produce the wealth to sustain an enormous increase in the world's population and to begin to realise our new ambitions of distributing wealth more justly. Hayek is a key figure in the Australian School of Economic Thought and the approach that takes the motivations and actions of individuals as a basis for understanding society. This is associated with the free market approach, which opposes interference in the setting of prices by agencies such as governments and large corporations. In this view, any efforts to regulate or plan the economy, even if undertaken with good intentions such as reducing inequality or protecting the environment, are viewed as disturbing the harmony of market coordinated activity, leading to less and more unbalanced wealth for all. Markets put a price on the things that are bought and sold within society. These include people's labour, which they can sell to an employer in return for income, and nets then buy things. Advocates of free markets argue they are just to match the demand for any item with the supply of it. If demand goes up, prices will rise, encouraging more production. When more supply arises, prices go down. The relationship between supply and demand is a fundamental idea of economics. As the economics of populations grow, an increasing number of human interactions take place through markets. These also extend from operating locally, nationally, and ultimately across the world. As countries commit to free trade and remove the barriers to it, the advocates of market economies argue that globalisation strengthens markets' abilities to coordinate people's activities in ways which bring them mutual gain. Without any need for interference, in this view, markets, the price mechanism, and supply and demand ensure that the self-interest behaviour of all individuals produces harmony and order rather than chaos and conflict. This school of thought does, of course, assume the rational self-interest is the key motivation for all people. Section 1, the tragedy of the commons, examines the concept of social, external, and private costs and benefits in free market economics, with particular reference to public goods and common resources. Section 2, distinguishing common resources from public goods, looks at the differences and similarities between these two goods and explores two ways of dealing with externalities, taxes, and privatisation. The contemporary application of carbon emissions considers the ways carbon emissions are treated to common resources have been dealt with in the contemporary world. The drive to establish property rights interrogates the ideas around the privatisation of shared resources further and outlines other ideas about managing common resources. Page 111. Free market approaches are often criticised for allowing individuals to focus on their own interests with no regard for the wider impact of what they do. This might lead to production and consumption of decisions that make sense to the person or organisation that takes them, but are collectively disastrous when added to all the other decisions simultaneously taken by others. Supporters of the free market argue spontaneous orders rise because market prices give people all the information they need to coordinate and harmonise their behaviour. In the view of the free markets, even extreme coordination problems such as the tragedy of the commons can be resolved and are best resolved by letting people organise themselves without political intervention. The problem of the social cost. Hayek had never claimed it was an original view. He traced it for a long line of earlier economists, notably Adam Smith. Smith famously likened free markets and the price system to an invisible hand, who guided people's activities as producers and consumers without any need for the visible hand of government or corporate management. Smith, free markets enable and encourage people to pursue their self-interest. Producers seek the highest profits, and consumers seek the greatest satisfaction for the least expenditure. He believed that free markets would harness the effort and creativity that result from this, and make sure that everyone gets the best deal while doing what is best for themselves. People end up doing what is also best for society. By the end of the 20th century, free market ideas and gained by country had been taken up many Eastern Europe, Asian and Latin American countries in place of attempts at centralised planning for fast development. Governments in Western Europe and the United States had also reaffirmed a commitment of free markets, retreating from models combining planning and substantial welfare state. Yet as economics and populations continue to grow, dominance of the free market encountered a challenge from the natural environment and its inherent limitations. The earth has scarce resources whose value might not always be reflected in the price system. If such resources are wrongly priced or not priced at all, they might not be effectively allocated and sustainably used in the right way. Free markets is always predicted. Hardin's 1968 model of the tragedy of the commons, introduced in Chapter 1, turned directly against Smith's invisible hand. Hardin described how free acting agents could inadvertently ruin an economy by overusing its common resources. The tendency to assume the decisions reached individual will, in fact, be the best decisions for the entire society is undermined in relation to the commons, who said fate is rebutal to invisible hand. Hardin, 1968, page 1244. For Hardin, the tragedy occurs because individual pursuit of the self-interest has damaging, unsustainable collective consequences. The model of the invisible hands assumes that individuals' actions also provide an external benefit. In other words, a benefit in addition to and beyond those that are just between the buyer and the seller, even if it's not intentional. In the model, companies' pursuit of profit and consumers' pursuit of satisfaction lead them to do things that also benefit in society. For example, companies want to make money for their shareholders, but to do so, they have to provide goods and services that consumers want to buy. However, with a common resource, or that is limited supply, one person increasing consumption does not bring benefits to others, quite the reverse. Land and natural resources contain the prime examples, as already shown in chapters 1 and 2. When one more sheep is grazed from the common, the farmer gets all the extra benefits while the others lose out. There is a loss of space and erosion of vegetation and soil in the rest of the community. These are external costs imposed by the individual on everyone else outside the buyers-sellers relationship. Hardin drew attention to problems that arise when individuals don't have to pay the fuel cost of their actions. It is then possible for an activity to be one person's interest but against a collective interest. He suggested that leaving people free to pursue profit will result in bad social outcomes like overgrazing of the commons, and insensitive pollution of land, sea and air. The car provides a way of illustrating this debate. As was introduced in chapter 1, individuals may prefer to travel by car as they think is faster, cheaper and more enjoyable than travelling by train. In what sense is it cheaper? Private costs. The amount any one person pays to drive is direct and clear. These are some of the costs that the activity drive involves. The full or social costs would include the indirect cost to the community when people drive. Cars create noise, air pollution, congestion, and damage to the road. These represent external costs which the whole society suffers from or has to pay to remedy. Page 113. Those external costs fall on the whole of society. The individual doesn't pay for them alone. This means that an action that is beneficial for the individual is damaging for society as a whole. In other words, social costs, which are much higher than individual private costs, exceed social benefits, which are just individual private benefits. In making a particular journey by car, an individual gets benefit they value at £10–15, pay a cost of £12. While the external cost imposed by the journey work out around £4. Why might society want to restrict individual car use? In the example, the individual benefits from their car journey because private benefits of £15 exceed private costs of £12, yet the journey causes a loss for society as a whole. Because social benefits of £15, I'll be with you in about 5 minutes if you're around. Plus £4 in external costs equals £16. The social cost of car journey, which include both private and external costs, outweigh the social benefits. External costs or negative externalities drive a wedge between cost-benefit calculation from an individual viewpoint and a social viewpoint. The common problem can now be seen as one that arises when social costs of a person's actions exceed the private costs, i.e. external costs. In this case, there will be a tendency for society's scarce resources to be overused. Roads are congested and the air around them polluted because they're the external cost imposed by another aiding role. To put this agreement in summary, for negative externalities mean that social benefit, private benefit, while social cost equals private cost and external cost. So even if private benefit exceeds private cost, the social benefit can fall below the social cost and is bigger than the private cost. 1.2. Social benefit and externalities. Externalities created by the individual actions aren't always negative. Some can also confer external benefits, gain which flow to others too. If a programmer can create some useful freeware, then many others can download. Or someone brighten up the neighbourhood with their front garden, they create positive externalities. Page 114, I'm going to stop that there.